now we'll have our second panel today. And our second panel is going to look at US refugee policy at the current time. As we all know, we have a new administration that views refugee protection issues a bit differently than past administrations, and in many ways is seeking to reduce America's time-honored role as a safe haven for refugees, and as a result is weakening our leadership globally as a protector of human rights. So today we have four excellent panelists who will discuss the current policy position of the U.S. toward the protection of refugees, especially changes that are being proposed and in some cases implemented by the new administration. And they will offer an alternative vision to our current course. I will introduce them in the order of their speaking, and then we'll have a question and answer session. Program note, we have to get out of this room by noon. I think we're ahead of schedule on our program, so it shouldn't be a problem. And we plan to end a bit before noon, but once we're done, if we could move our conversations to the hall so they can come and change the room, that would be great. So our first speaker is going to be Todd Scribner, who is a contributor to our project, authoring an article. He is also the education coordinator for the Migration and Refugee Services of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where he's edited and contributed to a volume on the 10th anniversary of the U.S.-Mexico Bishops' Strangers No Longer Pastoral there. Todd is also the author of various books on church history and other issues, and has a PhD in religious studies at Catholic University. And in his article, he talked about the class of civilizations in our country. And he will sort of set the table for us as how we got here in terms of the politics, but especially in terms of the culture, and what are some of the sources of some of the anti-refugee sentiment we see in our country and the xenophobia. So that'll be a good way to set our discussion. Our second speaker will be Melanie Nezer, who's also written for the CMS Journal on Migration and Human Security in our US Refugee Program collection. Melanie is currently Senior Vice President of Public Affairs for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. She oversees communications, community engagement, development, and policy and advocacy for that agency. In previous life, she practiced immigration law in Miami. So welcome, Melanie. Our third speaker is Mr. David Robinson. He's the Executive Director for Jesuit Refugee Services USA, and in his former life served in the Senior Foreign Service, serving in a variety of diplomatic posts in Latin America, Europe, and the Near East. He also served in important posts in the State Department as Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict and Stabilization Operations, and as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees, and Migration. His most important credential is that he's a graduate of Notre Dame University, fellow alums. So welcome, David, thank you. And our last but not least is Grisez, who is the Special Counsel for Public Service and Litigation here at Fried, Frank, Shriver, and Jacobson, who are our hosts today. Karen has successfully represented numerous asylum applicants and is an expert in the U.S. asylum system. She has served on boards of the American Bar Association, American Immigration Lawyers Association, as a leader in the area of pro bono representation. So an excellent panel we're looking forward to, and we're looking forward to your comments. So I'll call on Todd to start us off.
Sure. Well, first, thanks to Don and to Kevin and to Rachel and the Center for Migration Studies for putting together this event and all that they do. I'm always appreciative when I'm invited to contribute to something that they've developed. It's a real pleasure. To get to my theme right off the start, I want to just get it right out there. What I'm not going to do, what I want to do is put up the theme that politics lives downstream from culture. And that's sort of the central theme that I'm going to be looking at. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that the pre-political conditions that are at play, that people take for granted, are in some respects a priority, sort of prior to the policy and political debates that are at play in the world. I don't want to get involved in a sort of academic discussion of what we mean by culture, but really just this kind of straightforward notion for our purposes today. It involves the philosophical assumptions, the prejudices that we have as a people, the traditions that we invoke and that we engage in, the hierarchy of values that we embrace as a people, the symbols and the sort of the symbolic structures that reinforce those values and those traditions, and finally the narratives, both comprehensive and less so, that we use to navigate the world. It's these kind of paradigms that we take for granted sometimes and don't always make explicit in our work. Why is this important? Well, these pre-political kind of conditions really lay the framework for our political and policy debates. They make possible certain options and they make impossible other options, depending upon kind of the hierarchy of values and other elements that are at play that we affirm and uphold as true. And that shifts in culture can open up new avenues for debates, new policy options, new legislation, so on and so forth. And so it's really important to understand, in my view, these pre-political conditions, these cultural questions, if we want to understand the state of political debate and policy discussions at play in Washington, D.C., on the state level and the local level, or even on the international level. And so obviously today we're talking about the refugee resettlement system. And understanding what the pre-political conditions are that have given rise to where we are in the debate, and particularly as it pertains to the Trump administration, is, I think, a useful exercise, because it will put us in a position that will allow us to better understand where we are and where we need to go. Now, what I'm not going to do as a consequence is to talk really much about policy at all. My fellow panelists will be, I think, doing a deeper dive into political questions, policy questions, and kind of unpacking some of the things that have gone on over the past several months. And suffices to say, I take for granted that many of you have at least a working knowledge of what's going on. The executive orders on January 25th and the 27th, the last of these being the most important for our purposes, and some of the follow-up judicial challenges and so on and so forth. You have kind of a sense of the narrative that's gotten us to us here. And so where to begin? I think that one place where we can begin, and it's a helpful place to begin, is in the context of the Cold War. Why is the Cold War important since it ended a quarter of a century ago? Well, the Cold War is really the context within which the refugee resettlement system emerged, developed, and matured. It was really shortly after World War II that the Displaced Person Act of 1948 was put into place, which really formalized the refugee resettlement system, sort of at least in its early iterations. And for the next 40 years after that, we have a situation where the Cold War really helped to define what the refugee resettlement system looked like. And oftentimes it was put within the context of kind of this conflict between East and West, between Marxist and democratic capitalists, between socialist and the land of the free and the home of the brave, so to speak. These are just the traditions, these narratives, these symbol systems that we used to make sense of foreign policy, and which played back on domestic policy as well. And so, one of the things that we need to look at then is sort of, you can see in the Hungarian Revolution and the refugee system, the refugee crisis that followed, Cuba, Vietnam, Central America in the 1980s. This kind of Cold War context was really, really important for defining who we wanted in, who we didn't want in, how we approached the situation, and what do we do in the context of refugees in particular. But then the Cold War ended, and the framework that we used to make sense of refugee resettlement began to fracture, not to mention the foreign policy approach that we took more broadly as a country. And there emerged a variety of other alternatives that sort of came into play over the course of the following years after the Cold War ended. You could look at The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, or Charles Krauthammer's notion of the unipolar moment, or, there's a number of different ones that vied to make sense of this new context in which the Cold War was no longer the Cold War, and things were different. It's my contention that, and particularly in recent years, and particularly following 9/11, what has emerged as increasingly salient as a framework for restructuring our foreign policy is this notion of the clash of civilizations. And the clash of civilizations was popularized by Samuel Huntington in the mid-1990s, maybe 94, 93. It was originally an article in Foreign Affairs, and it was proceeded to publish it as a book in which he developed it more fully. And I think that it became an important framework, a lens that we can use to kind of understand where we are at today. How so? Well, during the Cold War, there emerged blocs in which, the United States kind of developed certain allies, the Soviet Union developed other allies. The relationships were built largely along a political ideology, whether the Marxist or Democratic sort of a framework. And with the end of the Cold War, these relations began to fray, and these blocs began to fall apart. And Huntington's thesis is basically that in the post-Cold War world, political ideology as a framework has become less important as a mechanism to understand foreign affairs. And what has become increasingly important are cultural fault lines on which conflict will occur in the future. So as culture becomes a more defining and important feature of foreign policy and foreign affairs, we need to look at sort of what constitutes culture. And one of the central aspects for Huntington, although not the only variable, is the role of religion and the way in which religion plays out within a cultural framework. So fine. So then with the end of the Cold War as well, the blocs began to fall apart, as I mentioned, and countries and societies that had been aligned along East-West kind of nexuses began to free up and began to fall apart. And so one of the things you have is the United States kind of losing some of its hegemony over the rest of the world. It's what Huntington called the West and the rest, the West versus the rest. This notion that other countries began to find themselves. They began to develop more on their own terms. And these kind of cultural dynamics began to play more and more. And according to his vision, one of the basic fault lines is along the Christian-Islamic axis. And this is in important respects not a new phenomenon. Bernard Lewis, who's an historian of Islam, wrote some decades ago that the struggle between rival systems has now lasted for some 14 centuries. It began with the advent of Islam in the 7th century and has continued virtually to the present day. It has consisted of a long series of attacks and counterattacks, jihads and crusades, conquests and reconquests. And so this conflict between Islam and the Christian West becomes a major fault line upon which it was expected conflict would emerge. Particularly after 9/11 and subsequent terrorist attacks you can see in Europe and even in the United States, for a large segment of the population, this kind of notion was reaffirmed, if not confirmed in its entirety. And as a matter of fact, there are a number of high-level advisors within the Trump administration that have kind of embraced this kind of a worldview. Stephen Bannon, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with him, former executive editor of Breitbart magazine, did a regular radio show on Breitbart. It's kind of fascinating. You can actually access them still, in which he regularly talked about the fundamental conflict between Islam and the West. And that the West is at war with Islam, that we're foolish to deny that, we're foolish to ignore that, and we do so at our own peril. And that the refugee flows from Syria into Europe really functions as a frontal attack on Western society. And he regularly as well expressed a growing frustration with the United States for admitting Muslim refugees at all. In 2014, he attended a conference at the Vatican at the Human Dignity Institute, in which he complained of the growing secularization in the West, and that this was very problematic given that we were at the beginning stages of a global conflict with Islam. That we were letting down our guard, we were losing our core, our Christian civilization, and in losing our core as a Christian civilization, we would be putting ourselves in a very vulnerable position vis-a-vis an Islamic kind of radicalism that was very committed to their worldview. But he's not the only one. You have Michael Anton as well, who wrote a number of articles, perhaps most famously the article called the Flight 93 election, which came in support of Donald Trump back in, I believe, in September of last year. But he wrote elsewhere. For example, he wrote that in another article that, quote, Islam and the modern West are incompatible. When we welcome them en masse to our country, they change us and not for the better. He had a very strong conception of this kind of us versus them mentality between the West and Islam. Sebastian Gorka is another person who wrote a book called Defeating Jihad, And he argued that global jihadism is a new form of totalitarianism akin to communism or fascism, and we had to confront it forthrightly as though that is what it is. And if we don't, then we put ourselves at risk, we put the West at risk, and we put everyone who lives there at risk of what will happen if the jihadis take over, Western civilization. One of the threads that runs throughout this kind of dynamic is this notion of kind of Christianity as the core of Western civilization. And there are others that I won't go into now, but Stephen Miller, has this kind of air about him as well, particularly as perhaps applies more to Latino immigration, from Central America and Mexico. Jeff Sessions to some extent, you can extrapolate some of these ideas. And it's not as though these people are, dyed-in-the-wool, honorees of Samuel Huntington, the Clash of Civilizations, but the Clash of Civilizations provides a certain lens that we can understand kind of their rhetoric and make sense of how it would play out in sort of real time. Now, on the one hand, if this were merely academic, it wouldn't matter that much, right? I mean, it might be troubling if it belonged to the opinions of a small segment of society or academics or some crackpots on radio or something else. But Donald Trump won, and he surrounded himself with people who espouse these kinds of ideas. And I don't think that Donald Trump necessarily knows what the Clash of Civilizations is, and I don't think he would know if he passed Samuel Huntington, if the man was still alive, on the street. But nevertheless, here's where we are. He won. And so why did he win? Well, my sense is that this kind of conceptual framework of the Clash of Civilization actually meshes well, and it makes sense in some respects to the lived experience of a lot of people in America, and a lot of people who voted for him, who feel sort of disjointed and on unfamiliar terrain, sort of in their day-to-day lives. And you can look at some polling that was done, particularly during the election season, to try and make sense of what some of those dynamics are. And so I'd argue that there's kind of there's a trinity of factors at play here. I mean, first and foremost is the national security question. Following 9/11, the threat of Islamic terrorism, inspired terrorism, became front and center. And it has only grown through the rhetoric of, right-wing radio and, through events that have occurred in Europe and the flow of migrants from Syria into the European context as well. But if you look at the way in which Republicans and Trump supporters actually conceptualize this problem, it becomes readily apparent what a problem it is for them. And so 79% of Republicans, these are taken from polls that the Brookings Institution made. There's also polls from the Pew Forum and elsewhere. So 79% of Republicans and 83% of Trump supporters believe explicitly that Islam is at odds with American values, that it's incompatible. That 78% of Trump supporters and 66% of Republican voters overall oppose admitting Syrians into the US, and 64% of Republicans supported a temporary ban on Muslim immigration across the board. So there's this external threat of Islam that is this kind of overarching ideological system that's out to destroy us, kill us, do all sorts of nasty things to us. There's also an internal threat that's at play, namely allowing Muslim refugees into the country admits the enemy into your backyard. Why in the world would you do that? Sort of the conceptualization here, if you buy into the rhetoric and the narrative of this Islamic threat, it makes sense on its own terms. And a lot of people, bought into it. And Donald Trump, through his rhetoric throughout the election season, sort of played this angle up, quite a bit, as I think you're all aware if you watch the news at all. And there's also an internal threat. There's a secondary internal threat as well, which I pointed to before, and I'll get back to in a minute. And that is that the Christianity of the Christian West is decaying. That secularization is undercutting our ability to be American, to be Western, to establish and espouse the values and the ideals that we did for centuries. And this makes us more vulnerable. And we'll see that in a minute. Actually, we'll do it right now. It's these kind of cultural insecurities, these more, the place of Christianity in the West that becomes really important. And so 60% of Trump supporters believe that immigrants in general are changing American culture a lot. And 74% of those who hold this view believe that they are changing it for the worse. From 2012 to 2016, evangelical Christians, which were a major block of Trump support, believe, this is from 48% in 2012 to 59% in 2016, believe America is no longer a Christian nation. And most telling, perhaps, 68% of Republicans believe things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. 66% of Democrats believe things have changed for the better. And so there's a clear division within American society and a clear kind of affirmation among Trump supporters and many Republicans that things are only getting worse. And for your general average white Christian, who lives maybe in the Midwest and Trump voter who lives in Wisconsin, this can be very unsettling times, and it's not surprising that as Trump exacerbated these concerns, people may have turned to him to garner some support. Finally, and the third kind of pole in this Trinitarian dynamic is economic stagnation. Since the 2008 downturn, white evangelicals and not a few white Catholics, have not really recovered economically. And while they haven't recovered economically, their vote matters a great deal. And so Trump's promise to make America great again provided a significant boost. One statistic, is that 80% of Trump supporters believe that immigrants were burdens on the economy. So they're an economic threat, they're a cultural threat, they're a national security threat. And as long as this threat was front and center, it was very easy, it became voting for Trump, who promised to solve these problems, became a very generous appeal. So what am I getting at here? I don't know how much time. 2 minutes? 2 minutes. Okay, good. So in my final 2 minutes, the issue, of course, here is that there are kind of cultural underpinnings that have sort of made sense of Trump's approach to migration, to refugee resettlement as a whole. That these cultural underpinnings, this kind of clash of civilizations approach, understanding West versus the rest, this kind of Islam versus Christianity, mesh well with the insecurities of large segments of the population. And in some respects, you can talk policy all you want, you can propose legislation all you want, we can advocate for all sorts of things that we want, but until we really address the cultural underpinnings that give rise to the framework that has created these conditions, we're not going to be very successful. That's my concern. And so what do we need to do? We need to rethink some strategies, and I'll close on this, and we can talk a little bit more about sort of what we can do if you're interested. But I think one of the things that we need to do is rethink some strategies. We need to engage. Advocacy is very important, because if you don't advocate for your interests, you'll get walked all over by your enemies, and sometimes even your friends who are pursuing their own interests. But we need to do perhaps less emphasis on advocacy, or more emphasis perhaps on directly engaging people who inhabit rural America, small towns and big cities. Cultural and personal formation needs to take center stage, while lobbying efforts and grassroots mobilization in favor of a specific legislative agenda would take a secondary, although very, very important for reasons I just iterated, place in this process. We need to focus on shaping the culture, so that in shaping the culture, in the long term, we can shape the political debates that we have down the road, when we have an opportunity to do so again. Thank you.
My name is Melanie Nezer. I'm with HIAS. We are the global Jewish refugee organization. We have offices around the world. We provide direct services to refugees. We also are one of the 9 domestic refugee resettlement agencies, and we also provide legal services to asylum seekers here. And I am in charge of our policy and advocacy. So in that, that's my perspective here today. And I was asked to talk about how to be strategic in this new political environment. So I think, you set that up really nicely, because what we're talking about in terms of strategy is the immediate strategy, as opposed to, kind of fixing kind of the underpinnings of what's happening in our culture and our society, which we could have another conference on that, but right now it's like, okay, we're in this moment, what do we do? And so it's hard to have the answers to that, because this is not normal. That's the hashtag, right? Not normal. This is not normal. There are a lot of things that are not normal about this. The rules, the normal rules don't seem to apply. And I'm saying this, I've been in Washington since the very end of the Clinton administration, so all of the Bush years, all of the Obama years. So when I talk about, kind of the normal rules, I'm talking about that entire period of time. This is not a partisan issue in any way. This is new, what we're dealing with now. So that's complicated because every day it seems like we have new information. We are being kind of batted about by different, statements that are being made, different policies that are being announced, and it's hard to kind of keep our eye on the big picture. But we kind of have to because there are some things that don't change, or at least that haven't changed, and that we have to make sure don't change. And those are kind of the underpinnings of our government. And so far, that structure is holding, so we can feel good about that. We have a system of checks and balances. Our founding fathers, founding parents, whatever the right way is to say this, thought about this situation that we're in right now, a president that really maybe doesn't have so much respect for institutions, so created a system where that would be checked. So far it seems to be working. Of course, it feels like it's been 6 years, it's only been 6 months, so we have a ways ahead of us, but we do, we have a constitutional framework within which to work, and it's very powerful and very strong. I was in Australia at a conference a few months ago, actually like right after the election, and was hearing from some Australian advocates and lawyers talking about their system. And they are much more at the mercy of the political environment there than we are because, they look at our structure and say, at least you have protection in institutions, that you can turn to that will protect some of these things. So we do have that. Just a quick outline, you all have watched Schoolhouse Rock, you're all educated people, so you know there are 3 branches of government. So starting with the courts, we have had, this has been our biggest backstop. I don't think any of us would have predicted just how powerful and effective the courts would be in reining in some of these, these excesses by the administration. I will say that HIAS is a plaintiff in one of the cases against Trump in the 4th Circuit. The Iraq v. Trump case, they're listed first, we're listed second, so everyone thinks it is Iraq, but it's also HIAS v. Trump, that's how we put it up on our website. It was not an easy thing to do. It was not an easy decision to make. We're the only resettlement agency that is, directly involved in the litigation. Our constituency, our Jewish constituency, feels a really strong, emotional, powerful link to the refugee issue, based on our history and also our faith, but I think more broadly our history and in the last several hundred years, but particularly in the last century. So this was not a controversial decision in our community. But we are used to being partners with the government, and that's where we want to be. We do not want to be in this position at all. And this is not something we asked for, but the answer to the question was, should we do it? It's like, well, if not now, when are we going to stand up? Because this is pretty dramatic what's happening here. So, the courts, I'm not going to get in too much. You've all seen the executive orders. You know what the courts have been saying. We are, the executive orders have not gone into effect for the most part, the provisions that we're most concerned about. The litigation is ongoing, but so far, the courts have really said directly to the president. The president asserted, and I was there in the 4th Circuit for the oral arguments, the oral arguments. They said, basically their argument was the president's authority over immigration is not reviewable, and the courts have said, no way, it is reviewable. So that's been very powerful for us. There's also been litigation brought on a number of other issues outside the refugee context, sanctuary cities, orders that, policies that bar legal assistance or make it harder for mostly nonprofits to help their clients. The Texas Texas law that was now passed, SB4, there are challenges. So this is all very powerful stuff that we have on our side. Turning to, I guess I'm going from our strongest protectors down to, so the next one is Congress. And again, we're in a very strange political moment, but one thing that is eternal is that members of Congress want to get reelected. That has not changed. That was never different. So that's a powerful tool for us. The work in DC, if you really look at what's going on, no legislation has passed. We have gridlock still for a variety of reasons, including all the, the drama around the Trump administration. there are some terrible bills that have been introduced. You know, the House Judiciary Committee was supposed to mark up a couple bills this week, which has been postponed until next week because of the tragedy with the shooting in Alexandria. But you know, these are not new bills. These things have been introduced before, and one of them, HR 2826, was introduced in the last session too, or some version of it. They call it the Refugee Program Integrity Restoration Act. The Democrats call it the Refugee Program Destruction Act. So you can see how political this has become. There's also another bill that they're marking up that would roll back protections for child asylum seekers. So these are things that we are fighting in traditional ways, doing the best we can, as Todd suggested. I mean, this is important work. We can't just let get rolled over. So we're making a lot of noise, and I think it's been successful. Senator Schumer said like he feels like we're making a big difference on the immigrant refugee groups in Congress, slowing things down, making members aware of some of the pitfalls of this legislation. One thing I can say is all of this pressure, and there has been a lot of pressure and a lot of investment from refugee groups, faith groups, and others to really mobilize the grassroots. It has really energized Democrats. I mean, before the election, Democrats were not unified on these issues. There was a bill after the Paris attacks that 47 Democrats voted for that would have dismantled the refugee program. I mean, that's kind of what the result would have been. So, but we're not in that place anymore. You know, the Democrats are very unified and mobilized in resisting some of this anti-refugee stuff. And then the Republicans are feeling a lot of heat too. I mean, this was a bipartisan issue. It's hard to remember, but just a few short years ago, Republicans also in large numbers. I mean, there were some outliers, but supported the refugee program. And I think when you talk to them, and I know when you talk to them behind closed doors, there's still a lot of support. It's just this political moment that we're in. So there may be a tipping point where we make some progress there too. So far, most Republicans haven't shown leadership in this area, but that's not to say they don't agree with some of our policy positions. Some have, but again, I mean, this is something that we're going to have to just keep pushing on. One thing to look at kind of more in the bigger picture, I'm actually interested in what Todd has to say about this, is the example in Kansas, if anyone's been following Kansas politics. So in Kansas, Senator Brownback, former Senator Brownback, now Governor Brownback, has instituted this, he's called it like, I don't know, this grand experiment or something. He actually was our biggest refugee champion when he was in the Senate, so this is just also bizarre where we are now. But at this point, this goes beyond the refugee issues, but the Republicans in Kansas, who dominate every area of government, decided to experiment with basically this whole idea of kind of trickle-down economics, plus, where the idea of cutting taxes, cutting services, and expecting that would grow the economy. And it's been a dismal failure. And in the last budget go-around a couple weeks ago, the Kansas legislature, Democrats joined with moderate Republicans to veto the latest budget and to actually, to overrule Brownback's veto of their budget, which would raise taxes and restore services. So they were able to, so there's a shift, and I just for some reason found that very encouraging, and I don't know if you've been following that too, you probably have, but I think there's some kind of growing consensus that maybe this whole thing has gone too far, and that may play out for our issues as well. So it is important to keep the pressure on Congress because I think it makes a difference. And also at the state and local level, again, we've been doing a lot of work trying to just educate, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. Elected officials at the state and local level about the refugee program. Mayors are on board for the most part. They love refugee resettlement in their communities, but the politics is kind of overtaking kind of the practical concerns around this. And then just in the interest of time, turning to the executive branch. So it's I don't know. I mean, we're trying, all of us are trying, we're, in the Jewish community, everyone's saying, well, have you talked to Ivanka Trump? Have you talked to Jared? We're trying, we're getting mixed signals. Nikki Haley's saying really interesting and supportive things about refugees in Syria. I mean, I think the overall message is less about resettlement and more about helping them over there, which is their place that doesn't really exist. And if you look at the president's budget, there's no indication that there's real interest in doing that. But that doesn't mean Congress is going to go along with it. And in terms of the resettlement numbers, just for those of you who don't follow that closely, the president. So you probably speak to this more than I do. So the president wanted to set refugee resettlement at 50,000 this year. The courts have blocked that for the time being. But of course, he has total discretion starting October 1st to set that level wherever he would like to do that. So the president is saying 50,000. The courts are saying no, like 110,000 is still the number. You didn't follow proper procedures, so that's going to be the number this year. Then you have a budget that allows for the resettlement of 75,000 refugees, but the State Department didn't know what their budget was going to be until May, when Congress finally passed their spending bill for the fiscal year halfway through the year. So, given all that, I mean, PRM must be, is in a very precarious place trying to figure out how to proceed and respecting all of these different competing, targets. I think that, they're probably doing the best that they can. The expectation is about 67,000 refugees will be admitted this year if the courts don't, change their decision, which, hopefully that won't happen this summer. But, we have next year, and we really need to put a lot of pressure on Congress and the administration to get that number back up there. I mean, there's been some talk about it being less than 50,000. The president based his budget on 50. But there are a lot of, miscalculations, financial calculations in that budget, which will probably let us get to that number. So we need everybody's help. I mean, there are a million listservs. Like the advocacy does make a difference, especially if you live in, areas where you have Republican representation. Just meetings, calls, letters, it makes a difference. And it is really, I mean, it may not feel that way, but this is what we've got right now. So keep doing that, keep the pressure on. We have a lot being thrown at us right now, but I think we should feel good about, given this whole scenario that we're in, we've been able to fight back, and so I think we should recognize that. Of course, get some sleep, take care of yourself, self-care, all that stuff, because it's going to be a long, I like to say it.
Are we even more depressed now?
I was trying to be optimistic.
Well, first, Kevin, thank you. Don, thank you. And CMS, thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you as this progresses. I am new to the NGO world. I spent most of my career in the Foreign Service, as Kevin mentioned, and I'm now the Executive Director of Jesuit Refugee Service USA, which is the regional component of a global Jesuit organization working in 45 countries to help refugees and to defend their rights, with a focus on education as well. I'd like to start by recalling a comment that a very high-ranking member of UNHCR said around the time of the refugee influx into Europe in 2015, 2016. We were at a meeting in Geneva discussing this, and he said, listen, Europe doesn't have a refugee crisis. What Europe has is a management crisis. They didn't prepare for this. I think that's true, and I think that's absolutely correct to take that observation even beyond the confines of the immediate crisis in Europe and look at it more generally. We have an odd tendency, and I think it's kind of fascinating, to look at displacement issues, and particularly refugee movements, as a crisis, as some kind of anomaly. And every time it happens, it becomes a humanitarian catastrophe that we have to mobilize for and try to respond to. And it's not only the public sector bureaucrats who do this. We take that attitude even into a lot of our literature. Even my own organization includes that kind of attitude, I think, in its own documents. We talk about looking for the root causes of refugee crises and displacement. Root causes. The root cause is people. That's the root cause. We normally look for root causes for anomalies, heart attacks, market crashes, and things like that. We don't look for the root cause of childbirth. We don't look for the root cause of aging. We don't look for the root cause of the sun rising in the east and setting in the west. And let's face it, if you want to look at refugees, the first refugees, I guess in the Jewish and Christian tradition, are Adam and Eve. They were thrown out of the Garden of Eden. They were displaced. The whole Old Testament for the Christian side is a story about displaced people. It has been with us forever. This is not something new. It is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition of humanity. People will be displaced. As long as we live in a world in which there is scarcity, in which there's competition for power, in which other human beings conflict with each other, and that is a human condition, what we're dealing with is not necessarily an anomaly. What we're dealing with are the facts of life. Refugees are and always have been, and I venture to say always will be, a fact of our life. And therefore, treating it as if it's an anomaly, as if it's a crisis to be responded to or a problem to be solved, strikes me as rather foolish. Instead, what we should be doing is looking at this, as this UNHCR official said, as a management problem, something to be managed, as we would manage other normal parts of our life. I think that's absolutely correct. And I think the world has, to a certain extent, done that over time. We have created institutions like UNHCR. We have a robust NGO community that is global. The United States has been normally, traditionally, the leader in this through its generous funding, through PRM, through OFTA, through other public service organizations as well. So we have taken this on as a management problem to a certain extent. But I think what keeps us from really fully embracing the idea that, look, this isn't something odd that happens that we have to look at shock at, rather than an issue to be managed. There are two things really that keep us from fully embracing the management concept of this. One of those things is systemic, and the other thing is sentimental. The systemic problem is purely man-made. It is a government problem more than anything else. We have never solved the problem of bridging the divide in our concept, in our funding, in our organizational structures between humanitarian response and development. And if you look at most refugee movements around the world, the average length of time a refugee is in a camp or in a non-permanent, if you want to use that term, setting, whether it's urban or otherwise, is at least 20 years. At what point is it no longer a humanitarian crisis? At what point does that become a development issue? If you go to Dadaab, Kenya, I think we're all familiar with Dadaab. It has been there for, 30 some odd years. I first went there about 25 years ago. And it was where hell meets earth. It was an awful place. You go there today, there are travel agencies ringing the camps. I mean, it has grown up an awful lot. It's still a place you don't want to live. But nevertheless, it has, on its own, begun to develop. There are beauty salons and things there for people. They're building a city over time. They're doing this. But it is still seen as a responsibility of the humanitarian agencies to support Dadaab. And that goes for Kakuma and all of the other long-term refugee camps that you want to point to. That has the effect of draining their budgets so that when there is a surging crisis, like the Syrian crisis, the money's not there. So at some point there's a structural problem for us managing refugee movements and incidences around the world. And it's one that we can fix. Everybody is aware of it. Everybody who works in the arena, everybody at PRM and OFTA, understands that this is the problem, but we have never found the way to close the gap. You see it in the UN system as well, between UNHCR and UNDP. None of us has been able to figure out when does that transition occur. And that becomes a real problem in managing a refugee movement rather than responding to it as if it's a flaming crisis all of a sudden. The other issue, I think, is sentimentality. Suad McKenna, I think her name is, wrote a book recently called They Told Me to Come Alone. It's about her experiences as a reporter with ISIS. And it was reviewed in the Washington Post, I think, a week or two ago. And one of the comments she made I thought was very good. She was working with or traveling with groups of refugees coming into Germany. She's a German reporter. And she commented that, Germany and Angela Merkel got great praise from most people for opening the borders and saying, come on in. And among Angela Merkel's assumptions was that many, if not most of the newcomers were middle-class people, many of them professionals, who had been displaced because of the war in Syria. What Suad found was that's not really true. In this large group of people, there are a lot of very bad people in the mix who are taking advantage of this. There are a lot of criminals in the mix. There are a lot of people who are economic migrants, of course, coming into this mix. There's a counterpoint to that too, which I think is what Todd was talking about, with the people that see all refugees as threats. That's also a sentimental view of this. It's a negative sentimental view, that every refugee is a threat to the United States, a threat to our culture, a threat to our national security. So on both sides, whether it's we want to give a warm embrace to everybody who calls himself a refugee, or we want to stiff arm anyone who calls himself a refugee, both sides of that coin are very active in our response and prevent us again from sort of a clear-eyed view of a management problem that we have to address. It seems to me that this administration is exacerbating both of those problems, both the systemic problem and the sentimental problem. On the systemic side, by trying to destroy the State Department and USAID and to dismantle their ability both to support refugees in resettlement but also overseas, and to be a global leader to encourage other countries to do the same, which has been the political position of the State Department for many, many years. He is playing on the system, he's destroying the system, and I think he's doing it on purpose, that will allow us to manage refugee problems overseas and domestically. And he's doing it by playing on the sentiment, as Todd was pointing out, by really fueling the fires of people who are afraid, people who really are adrift and are looking for a place to pin the blame, and the newcomer is a great place to pin the blame. It's always been so. One off, and I apologize for not remembering the name, said the United States has always been friendly to migration but not to immigrants. And I think that's probably true. Every new group has had a problem like this. I am not pessimistic about this for exactly the reasons that Melanie pointed out. We are a nation of very strong institutions. And the courts, I think, have played an extraordinarily important part in blocking the worst impulses of a very bad administration. And I think that the institutions of government are functioning well. In my past life, I was responsible for PRM's part of the refugee resettlement program. It has always been a bipartisan program with enormous support on Capitol Hill. PRM traditionally, and I'm not speaking for PRM now, I'm not there anymore, but PRM traditionally gets much more money than it asks for in its budget, so it has tremendous support, bipartisan support, and that's still there, I think, for the most part on the Hill. And we can still, I think, tap into that history and that continuing, I think, reality that we have to do this well. So I think the institutions are strong and are capable of defeating the worst impulses of this administration. Secondly, it doesn't escape my notice that two of us sitting side by side here represent faith-based organizations, HIAS and Jesuit Refugee Service. Many, if not most, of the NGOs I encounter overseas and in the United States are in fact faith-based. And if faith is one of the fault lines in the culture war that you were pointing out earlier, Todd, the faiths are in the United States are in fact acting admirably for the most part. The organized expressions of faith are acting very admirably, I think, and are responding in a way that is going to, I think, blunt the worst impulses of this administration. So I frankly take a great deal of comfort in that. I think we're going in the right direction. I do think that we do have to be careful not to romanticize what we do for a living. This is a difficult management problem. We do have to be clear-eyed. We do have to recognize that people abuse the system. We do have to have a system in place that does allow a country like the United States to deport people it should deport, not to admit people it should not admit. This is what Germany got wrong in this last fall. It's what Turkey got wrong in the Syrian crisis. They did not have a system in place that allowed them to analyze what was coming in, that allowed them to protect their citizenry. And in doing that, you actually do, I think, set the stage for a warmer welcome for honest-to-goodness refugees. If you have confidence that your government, that your systems in place are paying attention and are protecting you as well as welcoming the appropriate people, I think you're in a much, much stronger position. So I think that's an attitude that we have to carry forward in our work as advocates on behalf of refugees, is the knowledge that yes, every government has a right, every country has a right to control its borders. Yes, it does. But I think that's something that we do recognize and we're carrying forward. The final thing I'll say, and it really does reveal my my prejudice as an old Foreign Service officer is that the antidote to a certain extent to the culture wars or to the clash of civilizations is the United States. It's important that the United States doesn't relinquish leadership. We are the ones who bridge those gaps. We are the country that manages to bring these peoples together in sometimes a raucous, but generally speaking, a very productive way. Our society is magnificent for that. We should never step back from that. And by removing us from a leadership position, which is what they're systematically doing at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, you are making us less secure. You're making the world less secure. And ultimately, by abdicating our responsibility as leaders in this realm, I think we're going to go down a very dangerous path. That said, and I'll close on this, again, I think our institutions, both public institutions and NGO institutions, are extraordinarily strong. And I think we'll not just weather this storm, but I think come out on the other side in good shape. Thank you.
My talk is a little different from the preceding ones in that I'm focusing primarily on the asylum system inside the borders of the U.S. And I'm talking a bit on a practical level more than on the theoretical policy level, although I do have a couple of policy suggestions that I'm going to share. But I'm interested in the segue that the antidote to everything that's wrong is the United States, because you'll hear in some of my remarks that I have great concerns about the way the U.S. is handling its own obligations, much less how it is or isn't leading appropriately in the rest of the world. But the place that I want to start out is just by a brief reminder contrasting asylum with refugee processing, and make sure everybody understands that the test for someone obtaining asylum in the United States is exactly the same as the test for whether someone qualifies for refugee status overseas in a legal sense. The elements are exactly the same. The difference is that someone seeks asylum when they are at the border of the United States or they're already physically present within the borders of the United States. And the obligations to entertain and adjudicate asylum claims are the U.S.'s obligations under international law and by statute. They flow from, and we started out with the discussion about, World War II and protections for people that were forced to flee persecution then. So we have the 51 Convention, the 67 Protocol, and then the Refugee Act of 1990. So there we have international law and U.S. statutory obligations binding this country. So, contrary to statements that have been made by leadership of both recent administrations, there is nothing illegal about coming to the U.S. to apply for asylum. There's nothing illegal about applying for asylum after what may or may not be a lawful entry to the United States, but applying for asylum is perfectly legal. Most of my suggestions go to how to best preserve access to asylum adjudication in accord with that existing law. And my main point is that you can have disagreements about policy and what asylum policy should be, but you can't have disagreements about your obligation to carry out existing law. And there has to be an opportunity for every asylum seeker to have a full and fair adjudication of their claim under existing law. I totally agree with the point that every asylum seeker should not be getting asylum. I'm not a person that says we should have open borders or, anybody who asks for asylum should be getting it. But at the same time, I think our system should not be structured in a way or so-called streamlined in a way that people don't actually have the opportunity to present their claims, and that the system should not be a system in name only, but really just a fast track to how fast can we reject people and turn them around. So the gist of my comments are looking at some of those places where And I would say some of this is not new. Some of the weak points or the failures in our asylum adjudication system and in the expedited removal system in particular, but I want to highlight a bit where I think there are heightened threats in the current administration and where we need to be particularly vigilant about honoring our international and US law obligations. Two big impediments to full and fair adjudication that I see are the detention of asylum seekers to begin with and the lack of access to counsel for asylum seekers. And I'm going to talk a bit about some of the practical realities on both of those points. Detention harms adjudication of asylum claims in multiple ways. I'll note, and there was a reference earlier to some litigation, that it's already been held by the district court here in the District of Columbia that you can't have a blanket policy of detention for deterrence, but there's still the opportunity for individualized adjudication of whether somebody should be able to be released from detention pending an asylum claim. And I think it's fair to say that that undercurrent, that rationale of deterrence is one that still infects the way recent arrivals, particularly those in expedited removal, are being processed. And that is something about which we have to be vigilant, even if it's not called out as squarely as the rationale being deterrence. It's still there, and I think it's hard not to detect that deterrence is a big part of what's going on. And I would say that's primarily for the Central American refugees coming to the southwest border, but not exclusively so. There's deterrence at work in trying to discourage other asylum seekers as well. So why is detention harmful to asylum adjudication? One, the fact of detention itself is very harmful for many people. A lot of people have had very negative experiences in their home countries with law enforcement, with detention, with imprisonment, with perhaps just confinement, kidnapping, or other kind of hostage situations, and they come here thinking they're seeking peace and freedom and find themselves back in that kind of a confining situation. The detention itself can exacerbate symptoms of trauma, anxiety, depression, memory difficulties, and all of those things can impair the ability of applicants to fully relate their claims. And I'll add a footnote, which is the recent spate of deaths in ICE detention at a really rapid rate puts at even a more fundamental level the way detention can operate to impair people's ability to present their claims. It's operating, it seems, at some level in some facilities as, you know, an impairment to people continuing with life. But the thing that I want to highlight is for the mothers with children, those in the family detention context. Imagine what the mothers are facing when they see the effects, not the ones that I described that happen to adults that have experienced trauma, but those watching their children experience the effects of detention, inability to live freely, talk freely, sometimes eat what they're used to, speak their own language, play, make noise, get health care, all of those things, that the coercive effect that often affects adults faced with detention, that which compels them at times to just say, it's too much, I can't take it, I'm abandoning my claim, no matter how legitimate, and I just have to get out of detention and go back. That in the family detention context, where people's primary responsibility is to protect their own children, is, I think, a very serious concern for us. Being detained also interferes with the ability of asylum applicants to meet their burden for corroborative evidence that's required in U.S. adjudications post the passage of the Real ID Act. So imagine being in detention, not speaking English, but having the responsibility to get documents corroborating your claim from overseas, send out whatever requests, fill out whatever forms, receive documents back into the detention center in the U.S., get whatever required English language translations there are to be able to submit foreign language documents. And that's only talking about documents. Imagine the obligation to identify witnesses, arrange for testimony, whether live or telephonic witnesses overseas. How is a detained non-English speaking person going to have the opportunity to meet those burdens in a realistic way? It's obviously a huge problem. Then there's the expedited nature of detained cases. If you start with the assumption that new arrivals are likely to be held in detention, those detained cases are, even before the recent executive orders, heard on an expedited basis. So that means a limit to the time somebody has to prepare an asylum application, limit to the time they have to prepare their case, let's say 2 or 3 weeks, maybe a month at the most to get a lawyer, a couple of weeks to prepare the asylum application, maybe a month or 6 weeks to fully prepare for trial. That's a huge burden in a represented case, but if you're talking about an unrepresented person, you can see how the fact of detention and the expedited nature of those proceedings makes it impossible for somebody to meet their burden. Then you layer on top of that the recent executive orders, which emphasize in direct terms the importance of fast adjudications and adjudications close to the border. So people are detained in remote rural areas. The asylum officers doing the credible fear adjudications are being sent, posted directly at the border to make adjudications go faster. Immigration judges now are being detailed in high numbers to the borders to make those hearings in detention go faster. That means the merits hearings are going to be conducted faster, and the shortfalls in the ability to produce the appropriate corroboration are going to be heightened, and final decisions, again, by people less well equipped to take their own appeals, should appeals become necessary, are really going to start to turn up. So the expansion of expedited removal pursuant to the executive orders is also a big concern. That prong of the executive order has not been implemented yet, but the authority is there, the direction is there to apply expedited removal throughout the United States, not within the 100 miles of the border as it's currently being implemented, and to persons who cannot prove they have continuous physical presence in the U.S. for the last 2 years. So that's potentially a much larger number of people subject to expedited removal, and then in turn all of the other burdens that I identified. The remoteness of the detention centers themselves, I focused on the southwest border, but that's not the only place that it's a problem. Even in our area, the principal detention center is about 4 hours away in Farmville, Virginia. So it's going to take me into my next point about access to counsel. But you can imagine by citing detention centers and holding detained asylum seekers in remote facilities where there is very limited access to paid counsel, much less people who will volunteer to take that amount of driving time, totally unproductive in terms of the work required. That burden on access to counsel burdens outcomes. So on the access to counsel point, I think it's no secret that regardless which study or what report you look at, whether you're talking about children or adults, detained or non-detained, the success rate in winning some kind of relief either before the asylum office or immigration court is far, far higher. I think a fairly standard number is about 6 times as likely. There are estimates a little lower or a little higher if you have a lawyer. So having asylum seekers in a situation where they have no guaranteed right to counsel obviously greatly impairs their opportunity to make their claim for relief. The government's position is that there is a right to counsel, a privilege to counsel, but at no expense to the government. And until now, the government has funded in about 1/3 of the detention centers legal orientation program that give legal information, but for the most part not direct representation. And there have been some attempts at funding certain small pilot programs or the Justice AmeriCorps program where there has been in certain limited cases, particularly for children, the opportunity for paid counsel, but those, both of those types of programs that I've mentioned, I think have their funding very seriously at risk in the current administration, which will mean unrepresented people will face more of the problems that I talked about before, put an increased burden on the court system, and most importantly, impact the outcomes for people who are otherwise potentially qualified to receive asylum. I'm going to try to hurry up because, you sure? Okay, thank you. A couple of other points. These have to do with interpretation of existing law, but two things that are squarely impacted by the executive orders but will also affect potential outcomes. One is the availability of parole. Parole is available to asylum seekers, and the rule is that if somebody can prove their identity, their nationality, and their likelihood that they're going to show up for their hearings, they're supposed to be eligible for parole. Historically, before this administration, there were jurisdictions that were better than others in the way they adjudicated those parole requests and the likelihood that an asylum seeker would be granted parole. Anecdotally, I'd say after the election and even before the inauguration, reports started coming that parole was being denied more and more frequently in not factually disparate cases. But now, after the executive orders, there's a real direction to curtail the availability of parole. I think the quote was that the agency is directed to end the abuse of parole provisions currently used to prevent the lawful removal of removable aliens. So the implementation isn't fleshed out, but the clear direction is there that parole shouldn't be given the same way it should have. So if you spin it out, if people don't get parole, if they stay in detention, all of those things that I talked about, the inability to relocate with family or friends, the inability to obtain counsel, the necessity to proceed on a fast track, all of those problems, again, feed in to implicate outcome. Another thing in the executive order is a impetus to change the standards for credible fear interviews, which historically had been pretty high rate of success, a pretty high rate of finding credible fear. But again, that has started to erode some in recent times, and the executive order directs the determinations to be conducted in a manner clearly consistent with the plain language of the regulatory provisions that govern credible fear interviews, suggesting that even what we had before has not been consistent with that clear language. So the parole provisions and the credible fear, I think, are areas where the law hasn't changed any, but there's a clear suggestion that the interpretation should, and particularly with hiring a large core of new ICE agents who are the ones going to be doing the parole determinations, and new asylum officers who are the ones going to be doing credible fear interviews at the border. The likelihood for folks to buy into the so-called new standards rather than some of the more traditional protective standards applied by the ones who really come out of a protection mentality present a real risk. So totally out of those sort of day-to-day realities of detention. Two other things I would talk about, two systemic changes I would suggest. One has to do with integration and education of CBP officers about the need for protection. Since the split up of the old INS and ICE getting in one bureau, CBP in another, and USCIS in another, the protection mentality, the benefits mentality has really gotten out of those other two agencies without much common leadership. And what I've seen and heard, and I think Don may have even been present on this delegation where this happened, I was on a tour of lawyers and judges to one of the CBP facilities in California, and they literally, the CBP officers taking us on a tour literally told us, and excuse me in advance for the language, but it's a quote, the asylum officers were a pain in the ass to CBP because they're constantly down there trying to tell them about all this asylum stuff, and they don't get it. The asylum officers don't get it. And the CBP was bragging about how if they could keep somebody in secondary long enough, they could break them because they know what's really going on. CBP is the one who really knows how to protect people. And the asylum office director, the training people are an impairment to them, an impediment to them, a pain to them. So I think there's a real need for, I say integration, but more than that, maybe even oversight, but certainly an embedding, a better training, a better, to take the checks and balances language, some kind of way of infusing, while you respect the responsibility of CBP to do what they're doing, to not make the protection element their enemy, but to educate them about how it needs to come in, how those obligations need to work together and be balanced rather than being something totally different. And the other change, which sounds completely different, but it's one that the American Bar Association has been suggesting for a long time, and other agencies have been on board with this as well, is in the first instance when asylum seekers pass the credible fear interview in expedited removal and get referred for full 240 proceedings in immigration court, I would recommend having jurisdiction over those claims put in the first instance before the asylum office, so that those asylum seekers who have already passed credible fear do not have to undergo their first adjudication in an adversarial system with an immigration judge and a prosecutor. That kind of system costs more money, takes longer, is less efficient, really adds to the backlog and the burden of the immigration courts, so that people who really need to get removed don't get removed as effectively as possible. But the other piece of it is, besides being faster, less costly and all that, going back to the psychological issues that we talked about, the ability of somebody to present their claim, asylum officers who are specifically trained in the psychological issues dealing with victims of trauma, specially trained in country conditions, specially trained in the law governing the most common types of asylum claims, particularly social group claims. I think those go better at the asylum office. They're better equipped to handle them, but I say that recognizing that the asylum office does not currently have budget, have resources to adjudicate those kind of claims, so that recommendation has to be married with a recommendation that they get resources to take that part of the workload off of the immigration court. So I'll stop there, and thank you, Deb.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for questions, if anyone has questions.
Hi, thank you all so much for this great panel. I have a question. My name is Hillary Mellinger. I formerly worked at a nonprofit in this area, and now I'm doing my PhD at American University. So I have a question for Executive Director Robinson and for Karen Grisez. You actually signed co-counsel agreements with the Tahrir Justice Center, so I remember you guys do great work. So for Executive Director Robinson, just a general question about how the number of refugees that will be resettled in the United States is set, because you had mentioned, I think it was about the fiscal year and how this fiscal year you could propose a different number, but for now the courts have stopped things, and so I'm just a little confused on how that number is set and who decides it or who the decision makers are. And for Attorney Grisez, I was thinking about the executive orders, and you answered several of my questions, so this is just a clarification. It sounds like the credible fear interviews have already begun to be eroded with those changes. Fewer people are being released from detention. But I was intrigued when you said that the expansion of expedited removals hadn't yet occurred. So as somebody who now is an academia and isn't as active on the ground, when I read these executive orders, I'm sort of aware of their consequences, but since not all of them are being implemented, it's confusing, especially if you're trying to explain it to other people. Are they actually happening? Will they happen? Do we know? So if you have any insight as to, I know it's kind of a gray area, but whether it seems since CFIs are being affected, will things go past the 100 miles of the border or not?
Sure. It's important to note first that frequently when we talk about refugees in the United States, the talk immediately defaults, it's not really a problem, it immediately defaults to refugee resettlement. Only about 1% or so of refugees worldwide get resettlement anywhere. And it's not the first instance response to refugee crisis. However, it's a vital, durable solution. The process is the president ultimately sets the numbers after consultation with the Congress. The State Department presents to the president a suggestion for the numbers of refugees that should be admitted to the United States on an annual basis. That follows extensive consultations with the 9 resettlement agencies, but other NGO groups around the country who assess what they believe both their capacity is to receive refugees and also what they believe the need overseas is. So the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration holds these meetings throughout the year, but also one giant meeting toward the time when they're actually going to present the president with a proposal. Then the president takes it, not himself, but his folks take it to the Hill to have consultations, and then it's blessed.
On the question about the expansion of expedited removal, I don't know the answer to how far steps have been undertaken inside the administration to actually move forward on the expansion. I'm not privy to that, so I can't answer it. The executive order itself says, pursuant to section 235B1, blah, 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 the expedited removal provisions of the INA, the secretary shall take appropriate action to apply in his sole and unreviewable discretion the provisions of such and such a statute to the aliens designated thereunder. So the direction to the secretary is there. I think it's complicated. I think it's obviously big. Resources are a question, but you balance the provisions of this executive order with those of the others for the massive expansion of enforcement personnel, the creation of courts, movement of judges to the border and all that. My sense is that it's been directed to happen, and I hate to say will happen, but I fear that there will be movements in that direction. Maybe not from the 100 miles to the whole country all at once. I'd be guessing to say what's going to happen. I just think it's harder to accomplish and will take longer to accomplish than detailing judges and asylum officers to the border to carry out the other two provisions that we already do see happening.
Good morning, my name is Mina Trudeau. I want to thank, first of all the presenters, including this morning's earlier session, for their talks today. And I have two comments related to comments from this last session. First, for David Robinson, I agree with you in part that we're dealing with a management crisis, but building on Nanette Kelly's response to a question earlier, which involved Turkey as a host country, during what was then the height of the Syrian refugee crisis, 2013 to 2014, and while receiving literally thousands of refugees on a daily basis from Syria, but also from other neighboring countries and regions, Turkey was in the process of implementing new comprehensive immigration legislation. It was establishing a new civilian migration authority under its Ministry of Interior. It was working very closely with UNHCR, as well as multiple civil society organizations across the country to receive, to process and register and provide for the basic and legal needs of refugees and those who might require resettlement or other types of support. And during this time, the system that Turkey was using to address this mass influx was virtually exactly the same as the system that the EU had in place. The difference was that the EU never implemented its system, even though it had greater time to deal with this and though it had greater resources to deal with this. And so what I would suggest is that it is a management crisis in part, but it is also a crisis of political will, of social will, and moral willingness to take responsibility and to share resources. And my second comment relates to Todd Scribner's earlier comments. Huntington's so-called clash of civilizations, I don't believe is so much a framework for understanding xenophobic ideologies, but has greatly been used as justification for simplistic, dualistic, and antagonistic thinking that is really based on homogenous but also homogenizing preconceptions of who we are as people and who we conceptualize others to be. And so I think we also need to be very wary of potentially falling into those very culturally myopic perspectives that we may be seeking to challenge. And to that end, I suggest that everyone who has not already done so, just as a starting point, read Edward Said's Clash of Ignorance, which was published in 2001 in The Nation and is available online. Thank you very much.
Sure. No, I mean, I'll respond. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I mean, I guess one of my, and I didn't really say this explicitly, but one of my points that I wanted to make, I'm glad you're giving me the opportunity to do so, is not so much that whether or not Clash of Civilizations as a framework or as a paradigm or as a way of understanding the world, or the interpretation that certain groups of individuals give to it is actually accurate or precise, but that in a political context, it has salience. And insofar as it has salience, it has an important role in structuring political debates and policy decision making. And it is important insofar as we are here and to analyze these things, to respond adequately in ways that will either counter, undermine, or demonstrate the richer complexity of what Huntington is arguing. It is like a 400 or 500 page book, and there's been a lot written on it. So I mean, I guess I would just say that I would agree. And
Hi, Susanna Cunningham. So I've worked in refugee policy for the last decade, and I started a legal clinic for refugees based in Cairo, Egypt, under the tutelage of Barbara Hell-Bond from Oxford Refugee Program. And I have moved away from direct services. The clinic still survives and is doing great work, but I've moved away from it because those originally served Iraqi refugees and now serves refugees of regardless of nationality. About 2/3 of them were targeted by Trump's executive order. And where I think that we on refugee rights defense have always perhaps been on the right side, or the legal side, or the moral side, we continue to cede ground and beach towards these defenses and the rights that we're actually able to implement to national security. And that's been the case for quite a while. But it starts to me to sort of move, the national security people call it, left of the boom. Not to go where the boom is, but to go to where it started earlier, where the preceding sort of assailants started. And it starts at national security and where we can move from being right to being effective. And the part of efficacy is, even if you're right, if people secretly think, oh, it would be good to resettle refugees, or it would be good to send money to make sure that they're safe in the country, their first country of escape, we suspect that we might have to do these things for our security because we're afraid. So how do we deal with the fear? How do we say that there's the national security concerns that you have genuinely have to be identified and dealt with, and we have to be interpreted as realistic or reasonable, and we'll deal with those and offer an alternative to being more secure that also protects refugee rights and resettlement privileges as a moral obligation. So I want to ask if this is part of HIAS's initiatives, especially in terms of policymaking, if you see people that give you hope in this regard. And I'll return back kind of jumping on Todd's mention of Samuel Huntington. He also wrote a book in 2004 that basically on immigration that says that he believes that immigration policy is leading us to a division of our country into two. So more than just being nuanced, he seems to be a scholarly grandfather to a lot of white supremacy notions. So.
On the first question or the first point, Yeah, I mean, we've really been trying to catch up with this whole national security framing of the refugee issue. It you know, obviously precedes the current administration. I think unfortunately, particularly after the Paris attacks, so I think backing up a little bit, summer of 2014, when the images of Alan Kurdi were circulated around the world, I think we saw like a really important moment for actually awareness about the Syrian refugee crisis, an opportunity to educate people about the broader refugee issues around the world, a spike in concern and in the desire to do something about it around the world. And I think the people who oppose refugee resettlement seized that opportunity a lot faster and a lot more effectively than we did, because what they did was when that happened, they perceived a threat, right? Because there's this kind of middle ground of people that we're all trying to fight for the hearts and minds of people. We didn't jump in fast enough, and when the Paris attacks happened a few months later, which had nothing to do with refugees at all, as few of these attacks do. I mean, it's generally people who are born in the countries where the attacks occur. You know, they were ready to kind of mobilize, and they turned this whole refugee issue into a debate about national security. I don't think that we put enough resources, time, investment into it, and it wasn't just in the short term, but leading up. I mean, we have not done a good enough job in really educating. I mean, refugee resettlement was always kind of like, it's a small program, and given the context of immigration, it's even at its height was 200,000 people a year, and that was a long time ago. Generally, it's about 70,000 a year. Under the radar, we were just doing it, had bipartisan support, didn't really think about building a real base for it, and then we were just kind of hit with this. So, and also 9/11 underpins a lot of this too. The trauma of that is pretty much at the surface of a lot of our culture and society. So I think, this became a story about national security, and we've been trying to claw back the narrative ever since. I think we had to address those arguments head on. I mean, we know that the refugee program is not like the European refugee crisis. People, when they think about refugees in the US, that's what they picture, but the fact is refugees who come to the US are selected. We choose them. They don't get to pick if they come here. UNHCR will refer them to us. We vet them for a long amount of time through multiple security agencies. So we've had to kind of make that educational effort to the American people and to Congress, Democrats and Republicans. And I think we're finally we were, I think, making some progress there, and then we had this election. So it's a delicate balance, because there are people who have legitimate concerns about that need to be addressed, but we also need to remember that this is not a national security issue. In fact, failure to engage on refugees hurts our national security, and there are many security experts who are making that point much better than the humanitarian groups do. But I think shifting the narrative, making the case to people, working on the grassroots level to really educate Americans about what refugee resettlement is and who we're talking about is something we should have been investing a lot more in a long time ago, and now I think we're getting there. But this frame, is unfortunate, but I think it's unavoidable. But we have shifted away. Like, during the height of this, that was our first talking point, and now we're trying to respond to that, but really frame this as, who are we as a country? Do we want to lead by fear? Do we want to lead by power? Do we want to be open? I mean, this is about us right now, rather than this is about national security. So, in terms of our advocacy, I think that's a shift that we're trying to make.
On the national security front, I think it's important to recognize, and I'm sure you do, that too often we conflate the idea of national security with military or kinetic activities. Most senior military officers today, and many of them have signed on to say, look, you need to restore the budgets of the civilian side, to the State Department, to others. They recognize that national security is a much broader concept. I'm comfortable putting refugees in the context of national security, because, as you just said, our response to refugees is a matter of our national security as well. It does enhance our national security. It doesn't threaten it. And I think that's a message that most senior military officers agree with. And it's a message that is being given by them to this administration. It's falling on perhaps deaf ears. but I think the national security professionals understand that and embrace that concept generally.
Okay, we have time for maybe one question, and that's going to be mine. Actually, I have questions for each of you if we don't have time, so I'll pick the one. So this notion of, two notions, the 50,000 level has been overshadowed by the travel ban, in my opinion, and has the potential for devastating more lives than the travel ban does. But it hasn't gotten the attention that it needs to get for us to be able to get it higher, and the president has the most control over that. So the first part of my question is what can we do to highlight that issue more? And also, what leverage do we have to make sure that even if it is 50,000, that the State Department honors that? And then my second question is this notion of we'll take care of them overseas, which is troubling because it would put pressure on people, on the host countries, certainly, but the one notion that was thrown out but wasn't included in the executive order was this idea of safe zones within countries, and if someone could address what the fallacies of safe zones are if we choose to go down that path.
On the first question on the presidential determination, that's certainly going to be the focus of our advocacy this summer. I don't know how much impact we can have with the administration. There are a lot of people talking that are in the administration, and what we're hearing is, certainly we know that the budget is based on 50,000, but I'm not going to get into all the reasons why. But even that, the budget has to cover a lot more than just refugees, and their calculations make it look like it'd be very difficult for them to even resettle 50,000 with that budget. But I know that the national security voices and the humanitarian voices, and there are some in the administration. There's a lot of staff that's career staff, and there are some politicals that do care about these issues. It's not breaking through to the domestic policy side, and that's really where a lot of this policy is being made. So I'm not really sure how much influence we're going to have there. There's also some concern that the refugee admissions number, and the president really does have discretion here. It's pretty clear that the court order was, noted, basically enjoined that provision because there was a violation of procedure this year, but they can easily, the procedure is not that rigorous. So they can set the president can set the number where he wants to. But the issue is, so there's some talk of actually making it lower than 50,000 because it looks like we're going to be above 50,000 this year, and that's not what the president wanted. I don't know what that's going to be. But the pressure point, I think, is more on Congress because, Congress does have the power of the purse. They are not happy with the president's budget. I don't know what the outcome would be if there's money appropriated for a higher number of refugees than the executive order, but we're really pushing it on all fronts to try to get that number up. Our target is 75,000, which is woefully inadequate. And when you talk about, so there's 20 million, about more than 20 million refugees in the world. The estimate is about 2 million of them need resettlement. So not every refugee needs resettlement. 2 million of them will not be resettled this year. In fact, the total number of availability, if our refugee number is 50,000, in the entire world, all 27 or 28 countries that do resettlement is about 100,000. So it really is kind of like a lottery. So 75,000 is not enough, but it does take pressure off of host countries that are begging us to share responsibility for something that they don't have, why Jordan, why Turkey, why other countries, why do they have to, have the responsibility for all of this? It also, restores some of our leadership and also saves lives. That's the whole point of this. When 50,000, this year we know the difference between 67,000 and 110,000, that's a lot of people, a lot of kids who aren't going to school, a lot of people that aren't going to be able to, live in safety. This is a huge, huge issue. Like you said, it impacts a lot of lives. So I don't have the answer, but that's gonna be a big push for us, collectively, us, the community that does refugee resettlement, and hope that you'll join us in advocating for that. But really putting pressure on members of Congress and local officials is really probably gonna be where the focus is. And lifting up stories of the economic benefits of resettlement and the contributions that refugees make, and we're gonna be doing a lot of media work around that.
on the issue of safe zones, I'm not an expert, but we have tried safe zones before. The name Shriver should stick in everybody's mind, for one. Safe zones don't work. They don't work for a number of reasons. It's an appealing thought for a lot of people. It's neat and tidy, but they historically have failed, tragically. The very concept of it demands an extraordinary military presence to protect. That won't happen. An extraordinary humanitarian lift to feed people and to keep them alive here. So I think, hopefully that will fall off the table quickly as soon as real planners, if it's going to be pushed forward by the administration, as soon as real planners begin putting pen to paper, those things usually collapse and die. I would just once again say, the idea of taking care of them over there, I know what your point was, Kevin, but that, as you just said, that is what we do. I mean, very few get taken care of in third country resettlement, so we have to do that right. Safe zones is not the right way to do that by any stretch.
Okay, let's thank the panelists for their